fundamentally, being self-determined really has nothing to do with being in control. It's causing things to happen in your life. Let me give you an illustration of this in the way of a story. I was with the ARC of the United States, which is a national advocacy association for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families. And one of my roles within that context was to staff a volunteer committee that made an award for the Bill Sachter Award each year. And the Bill Sachter Award was given to people who had lived in an institution for people with intellectual disability, but who had moved out and into their communities and become, productive, integrated, valued members of their society. So, and it's named after, notably, a man named Bill Sachter. And Bill Sachter was himself a man with an intellectual disability. He's to the left of the picture here, who had lived in an institution in Minnesota and who had eventually found himself in Ames, Iowa, at the University of Iowa, where he was fundamentally adopted by the social work faculty there, and he went on to become a really revered member of that community, the university community, but in fact the entire community of Ames. The reason that he became somebody that had an award named after him was that in 1981 there was a movie, a Hallmark made-for-TV movie titled Bill, in which his life was portrayed, and it was portrayed by, who is this? Anyone? It's Mickey Rooney, for those of you who didn't grow up in the, well, I guess he started acting in the 1920s. So, and Mickey Rooney portrayed the life of Bill Sachter and won an Emmy for that. And really, this was 1981. This was the first example that went kind of nationwide of the fact that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities could in fact become contributing members of their community. They could live rich, full lives. So Bill Sachter became a spokesperson for the movement of moving people out of institutions into the community. And in order to be eligible for the national award, the Bill Sachter Award, you had to have one at the state level. So of course all of these were very compelling stories. But there was one that struck me as being the perfect example of the fact that self-determination is about causing things to happen in your life and not controlling your life. This was a man whose name was Jim. Jim was a man who lived in an institution, of course, most of his life. He had very limited speech. He had a lot of characteristics very similar to those I described about Ruth. He had cerebral palsy. He had a severe intellectual impairment. He had been thrown out of the sheltered workshop because of problem behaviors. He didn't have a biological family, anyone around that was really in his life. Things weren't really all that good for Jim. But he had the good fortune to be linked with an advocate in his community. And this woman came into his life and began advocating for him at a minor level, but eventually became his legal guardian. And eventually Jim's life changed because in large measure the actions of this woman. He moved from the institution, as did Ruth. He moved from the institution into a couple of apartments and eventually into a home that he owned. He got a competitive job in a local business where he had been employed for 8 years, and 2 of those years he'd been voted by all the other members, all the other employees as the Employee of the Year. He had developed a set of friends. He had a couple people living with him. They would go whitewater rafting, and again, all these things that seem antithetical to your conception of what Bill would be doing. Jim would be doing. And so he was selected as the winner of the Bill Sachter Award. And during the ceremony at which he was to be recognized, a well-intentioned person came up to the woman who was his guardian and told her that she really should be getting the award because she'd done all this work. And people, this person was not I think, intending to be mean in any way, shape, or form, and was in fact, legitimately recognizing the hard work that this woman had done. And she shook her head, and you could tell she was somewhat upset by that. It was an emotional evening, and she said, that's just wrong. She said, at every point in time, I was willing to settle for where we were. I was willing to settle for the movement back into the shelter workshop. I was willing to settle for the group home because it was so hard to make anything different, to change anything. But Jim would never let me. He told me in 100 different ways that wasn't good enough. So here's a man who really could do nothing much more than in some way advocate for his own wants and desires. And when I say advocate, I'll put those in quotation marks, because often he was doing so in ways that we would discuss as being problematic behaviorally. He might be, throwing a fit or doing things, being aggressive. But he was, in each of these ways, he was communicating. And the only way he knew that this wasn't what I wasn't, I'm not happy here, I don't want this. So simply by doing that, he becomes, in many ways, causing things to happen in his life. So we need to distance ourselves from this notion of control, because control implies this level of contingency and action that just isn't relevant. Being self-determined, and self-determination refers to self-caused versus other-caused action. And I believe that everyone really fundamentally can become more self-determined. And I'm not sure what it means to be fully self-determined. I think most adults are self-determined enough. But there are certainly adults in our society who are not very self-determined, and they don't, I think we can see the consequences of those kinds of actions. But by and large, and I believe that in our work with people, students and youth and adults with intellectual developmental disability, we approach this with the goal that every person can become more self-determined. And for people who have more severe disabilities, for whom have very few opportunities to do things, very few opportunities to make choices in their life, even a little bit can make a big difference in their lives. So self-determination is not control. I've kind of gotten to this notion through this that self-determination is not also about independent performance. Again, I call that the John Wayne theory of self-determination. You just do everything yourself. You pull on your boots and you just go do it. And in fact, it's not about doing it yourself. It's about causing things to happen in your own life. And it's not about just making a choice or just making a decision or any one of these things that maybe lead us to become more self-determined. It's broader than that, and it looks at the degree to which we are acting in our lives volitionally. We've talked about this notion of determinism and the philosophical doctrine of determinism, which posits that actions are caused by events that precede or are antecedent to the occurrence of an action, and behavior is governed by these kinds of actions. And we know lots of kinds of determinism. Determinism is not an uncommon idea in our society, whether we talk about it a lot or not. Virtually every other cover of Time or Newsweek has some story about the latest gene that has been discovered that causes us to act in certain ways. There's a gene for shyness apparently, a gene for spirituality. There's genes for, there's probably genes for about anything you want to find. And that's simply the notion of biological or genetic determinism, the idea that we act the way we do in part because of our genetic or biological disposition. Another notion of relative or familial determinism suggests that we act as adults in ways that we act in part because that's the way we were raised. It's the way our family act. It's the way we do that. So there's lots of things that cause us to act in certain ways. So self-determination fundamentally implies that people cause themselves to act in certain ways as opposed to someone or something else causing them to act in some other way, okay? And so people who are self-determined, they have this characteristic of self-determination. That is, they embody the quality of self-determination, referring to the degree in which that person acts or behaves in ways that are self-caused versus other-caused. Now, a couple of notions on this self-caused stuff, because you can go down a line of inquiry there that's not very helpful. Self-determination is not just hedonistic behavior. It's not just doing what you want because it feels good, you know, which it's sad but true. Self-determination is tied to this notion of us acting volitionally. Volitional action is the capability of conscious choice and decision and intention. So when we act volitionally, we're acting in ways that we've consciously chosen. Okay? So you've chosen at some level to be here today when you could be out on this perfectly lovely Wednesday afternoon where the sun is shining and you could be doing any number of other things. And I presume that you've chosen to be here not because you would prefer to be sitting here in you know, the relative darkness and warmth and listening to me go on and on and on, but in fact that you're doing this because there is some inherent good for it, for you in it. You are working toward a degree, you're working toward a certification, you're working to educate yourself so that you have a longer term outcome that will be a benefit to you and in the longer run will enhance your quality of life. And that's, you know, so there's a conscious choice to volitional action. It isn't just doing what you want to do. It's goal-oriented and goal-focused action that we engage in. But again, you could have equally chosen some other career, some other direction. You could choose, if you wanted to get up right now and to leave the room and to go down the elevators and not come back for the rest of your degree. You know, we have those kinds of options as adults in our society. So there is an intentionality to volitional behavior that moves it beyond just doing what feels good. And that intentionality, I think, implies these notions of goal-oriented. So volitional behavior has an intentionality. It's not just doing what you want to do, and it is that we want to act in ways that help us to achieve longer-term goals and to basically enhance the quality of our lives. Again, I presume that in some way, shape, or form, that the path you're on that leads you to this moment in time in this classroom will ultimately lead to something that improves your quality of life, either by making more or some money or by the gratification that comes with what you've chosen to be doing. So self-determined behavior is volitional action. It's intentional, it's goal-oriented, and it's focused on enhancing and improving ultimately the outcomes, quality life outcomes in your life. So now within the disability field, we see a lot of mix of the uses of the term self-determination. Self-determination is used often both to refer to these personal notions, you know, I want to act in certain ways, I want to achieve the things I want to do, I want to, you know, those kinds of things, along with the broader notion that corporate or political sense of it, of the rights of one's rights of people or peoples to act in ways that are self versus other directed in terms of groups. You know, we usually, in disability, self-determination is part of the language of the empowerment movement. And empowerment is a term almost always associated with some form of social movement and is used to refer to actions that enhance the possibilities for people to control their lives. So there's that word control, but remember we're talking about in the broader context of a movement. So the disability movement very frequently talks about these issues of self-determination with this language of control and power. And I think that's very appropriate, and I'm supportive of that. That's one level. When we talk about our own personal lives, we're really talking, though, about how do we enable ourselves and others to act in ways that are self-caused and volitional. The earliest appearance in the disability field of the term self-determination as applied to disability issues that I can find, and I've been looking for 20 years, so I'm fairly certain by now that this is about the earliest appearance, was in 1972, a Swedish philosopher named Ben Nurje, who introduced, for those of you who know something about the intellectual and developmental disability world, introduced the idea of normalization and the normalization principle to the service provision and supports. He published a chapter called The Right to Self-Determination in a 1972 text. And again, the notion of mixing that political and that personal sense of the term comes very early. Other than the rights that you gain at the age of majority, which in Missouri is the age of 18, Kansas as well, in Colorado it's 21, in Michigan it used to be 26, I think they've changed that. You inherit a set of rights, the right to vote, the right to enter into a contract without parental permission, the right to get married without permission. You at the age of majority, you inherit a set of rights, but really there's no right to make your own decision. There's lots of people for whom other people make decisions for them. That really gets more at a human rights level and what we talk about in terms of respecting human dignity and valuing people. So Nurje uses the term self-determination still pertaining to the rights of a particular group of people. In this case, it was people with intellectual disability he was writing about, but really moved its application from just that group sense to talk about these issues of individual or personal self-determination. And what he had to say in 1972, I think, is very relevant. I had the great pleasure of meeting Ben Nurje. He passed away a few years ago. A gentler, kinder person you would never meet, I think. And in our worlds, we're standing on the shoulders of giants who have moved what we do on. And in my world, Ben Nurje, and I think in many of the worlds that you all will be occupying, it's his shoulders we're standing on. So he talks about self-determination, and first of all, he articulates the importance of this personal self-determination to all people, not excluding people with intellectual disability. This is relevant to all people. And the only reason you don't hear about it more from people who don't have disability is that, by and large, most people as adults have opportunities to become self-determined. There's an interesting cycle in our lives where you do hear about it. You hear about it with peoples who are marginalized, people like people with disability who have restricted opportunity to act on their own lives and whatever else. But these same issues come up as we head toward the end of our own lives. As you begin to lose capacity, as you begin to and people begin talking about taking away your independence, talking about you moving from where you've lived. These same issues of self-determination become critical. And any of you who've dealt with an aging or elderly parent as you've made difficult decisions about moving from a family home into some place to get more support, or for those of you who work in gerontology and with people who are elderly and aging, these issues will sound very similar to the issues that I deal with in listening to people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So this is important for all people. And it's important because our society equates issues of self-determination with the respect and dignity to which all people are due. You become legally an adult at the age of 18. But of course, many of us know 35-year-old, usually men, who are still adolescents. They haven't taken on the responsibilities that come with adulthood. They're not willing to do the kinds of things that you have to do. The truth is, that we begin to be viewed as adults when we become to act in ways reflective of being self-determined, in making decisions about our lives and being responsible for actions in our lives, in setting goals, in moving, in being goal-oriented and goal-focused. And when we deny people with disabilities, and in many cases, think about the stereotypes you might hear about people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. You'll hear people talked about in terms of their mental age, as if a 30-year-old man has anything like the mind of a 5-year-old. I mean, that is so ludicrous as to be, ridiculous. And yet, you hear it all the time. We infantilize people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We talk about people with intellectual and developmental disabilities as eternal children, as holy innocents. The problem is holy innocents and eternal children don't get married. They don't get to have a beer at the ballpark. They don't get to do all the things that create a rich, full life. They're marginalized to be something that someone else is more comfortable with. And so when we deny people with disability the opportunity to learn the skills that enable them to become more self-determined, to have the opportunities and experiences to act in ways that enhance and further their self-determination, we're basically denying them the right and the opportunity to adulthood and the respect and dignity that comes along with just being a person. And if you know anything about people like Peter Singer and others, ethicists who talk about people with disability as something less than human, you begin to understand how critically important it is that we as a society talk about and respond to people with disabilities in ways that emphasize their fundamental humanity, not their differences. He talks about the fact that we define ourselves by how other people see us, and that other people define us by what we're doing. Basically, these issues of that, Salman Rushdie says, our lives teach us who we are. Too many people with disability in our society have been taught that they're the problem, that they really don't matter, that they can't do anything, and they've been told that enough that they believe that. When you've been in a career as long as I have, you have a few experiences where there's a big shift in the field. And for the field of employment for people with more severe disability, that came in the mid-1980s with the advent of the movement toward supported employment and away from just segregated sheltered workshop. And one of the things about supported employment, which is a set of strategies that enable somebody with quite severe disabilities to be supported and to be functioning in jobs that earn them real money, that are competitive. And we do that by a number of ways: job carving, we can job share. We have the tools, we have the sophistication to do this. I very firmly believe that there are very few people, if any, we can't get into some competitive type of an employment situation. What you'll see is that that's important because you get a job, you get money, but as much as anything else, what you see is people's expectations for you and their perceptions of you change when they see you sitting and working in an agency alongside everyone else and performing meaningful work, as opposed to being in the shelter workshop where you're stuffing envelopes and seeing and perform with all other people that look and act like you. It's these issues of dignity and respect that come with some of these types of things. And that's a critical part of the issue of self-determination. So it's not really surprising at all that people with disability are adamant about the importance of self-determination in their lives. They recognize, as Bob Williams articulated right at the start, that this is about rising expectations, dignity, worth, value, and respect.